Welcome to Against the Tide, the podcast where extraordinary social change makers share their stories and their wisdom. Against the Tide is a celebration of courageous women who create lasting impact by daring to forge their own path. We'll dive deep into powerful themes such as the complexity of identity and how it influences the choices we make, embracing change even when it feels uncomfortable, and how breaking free from labels can unlock your true potential. Join me, Jo Metcalf, to hear stories of incredible women who, by swimming against the tide, prove that extraordinary things can happen. This episode features Aida, Chief Executive of Thrive at 5. Welcome to what I know will be an amazing conversation with the CEO, Aida from Thrive at 5. Thank you for joining me today. Aida, I remember being interviewed by you and feeling full of doubt. How could I possibly impress this amazing, confident, intelligent woman? Luckily, I got the job, and the rest is history. Thank you for giving me the chance back then and for giving your time today. It's a real pleasure, and hopefully our listeners will enjoy the conversation. Let's start with a look back over your early life and how it informed your career. Did you always want a career with purpose?
Yes. As I look back now, I can recognise that that's absolutely where I hoped to be. But I think it's fair to say the journey's not been, it's not been a straightforward one, and it's certainly not been a straight line to where I am today, because I do think as I wake up every morning today, I live with cause, I have a purpose, and I don't know where I'm going, but I feel I'm doing the right thing for me. I've sometimes described my life, or certainly my adult life, as being a sort of game of two halves. I think, as you know, Jo, I had a first career as a lawyer, and that was quite a long career, 18, 19 years. And it wasn't where I expected to be. Yes, I thought I might be a lawyer, but certainly not a commercial lawyer, because that's what I ended up doing. And in fact, it's probably just worth backtracking a little bit as to why I even became a lawyer. I mean, in fact, at one stage when I was a lot younger, I wanted to be in the theatre. And my dad, who was always a great one for debating and persuading folk, suggested to me that the best way to deal with my acting desires and my wish to be on the stage was to become a barrister. And I fell hook, line and sinker for his coherent logic. And set off to be a barrister at first. So I did that I trained as a barrister. I then worked as a solicitor for some 14 years, and I literally did climb up that greasy pole. I was a partner of a law firm, as I now realise, the too tender age of 30. I don't think I was ready for it. And I span out the other side and went in-house for an oil trading company. And that was first half. And what happened, Jo, was that it was sort of personal circumstances that made for my pivot. I wish I could say it had all been planned and well thought through, but my husband and I discovered that it was difficult for us to have children. It took us many years to have our dear darling son Charlie, and I finally managed to get pregnant again and miscarried in 2011, and I think it was a culmination of not enjoying my job, but probably and honestly probably quite a lot of hormonal drugs that took me to a place of not just falling out of love with what I was doing, but actually having a breakdown. And I think it's an important part of the story. I ended up in a psychiatric unit for a while as I tried to recover. And whilst at the time it was one of the most awful things that's ever happened to me, I look back and I think it's one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I had to stop. I had to think about what I was doing, about my purpose. And thanks to a lot of kind people back then in that year, I call it the year of coffee, a year where I reached out to people who I admired, who I admire, who are doing great things with their lives, and I sought their counsel. And it was at that point that I went back to where I had been probably aged 18, 19, yes, wanting to be on the stage, but actually with a fervent, I think quite passionate desire to see a different world, a different community. Back when I was 18, 19, I'd worked at a Citizens Advice Bureau, and it was a time of, you're probably far too young to remember all of this, but poll tax, the unfairness of it, people who couldn't afford their mortgages, who couldn't afford their rent. I remember just appalling debt issues. I mean, it really sort of struck me. I'd go home every night from working in the Citizens Advice Bureau, troubled and upset by what I was seeing. And I'd been in that space, and I had sort of assumed that as I went into the law that I might become a criminal barrister, and it was self-doubt, lack of belief in myself, I think, that meant I didn't follow that route. But I was a young Liberal Democrat. I was out every Tuesday night with fellow young people thinking about the revolution, if you can call Liberal Democrats revolutionary. But it felt like that. It really felt like that. So there I was in 2011, and in some senses it felt like a return back home, a return back to who I was. And the wise words I had from people at that stage was that if I wanted to make that change, if I wanted to live a life with purpose, I needed to be very clear about the change that I wanted to see. I needed to be clear about the impact that I personally thought and wanted to deliver. And there was one cause that spoke to me. It had a louder voice than any others, and that was young people, the plight of young people, children and young people who, to me, are the world's innocents. We don't ask to be born. We are born, we live, and we're born to whoever we're born to, wherever we're born to. And that creates, sadly, great inequalities. And I'd always been struck by the fact that I had been incredibly lucky. I was the product of sort of two generations who had believed passionately in the power of education. I'd had the benefit of a stable home life, and that had taken me to university. It had meant I could become a lawyer. I'd had a rich life. I'd had everything, but that was an accident of birth and happenstance. And so to me, it was a no-brainer that where I should place myself was in a world of young people, children, who don't have that equality and fairness. And I sometimes think to myself, am I doing the right thing to do it in this country? Because that's where I've decided to focus my attention. And we see today the awful plight of the kids in Gaza and around the world who are suffering in a way that is inexplicable and unforgivable. But as I started back with purpose, I wanted to think about children close to home. I wanted to think about things that I felt I could do meaningfully, and that meant thinking about children in this country, in the UK. And I started all over again. I decided after trying to work for a school academy as an in-house lawyer that actually I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to go to the front line, or as close to the front line as I could get, and be closer to those children and make a change for them. So it was a huge pivot, and I was very fortunate to meet somebody, a man called Mike DiGiorgio, who himself had been in business and had set up a brilliant organisation called Greenhouse, using sports as a way to reach out to children, to speak to them about in a voice to which they could relate. It was a way of bringing children who had left the fold back in, and they put sports coaches and they still do, into schools around London. And use that as a route to mentor and support children back into education sometimes. And I was very fortunate to be given an opportunity to design, or to try to design, something for older children. So the project was working with school-aged children, and the idea was to think about how we might use sports as a way to help all of those children who leave school, and still do, at 16, without skills, without qualifications, without education. And we designed a sports coaching apprenticeship, which was funded by an organisation called the Royal Foundation. And it was through that I then was picked up by a very young philanthropic organisation representing now the Prince and Princess of Wales, but then the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge and Prince Harry. And I went in there to support their young people's programmes, and I spent a challenging but by and large happy time. I mean, dealing with social change is always tough, but it was an extraordinary place to be involved in some great projects of which I'm incredibly proud. And towards the end of my time there, so this was in the middle of COVID, I found and met the founders of the organisation that I now run, the founders of Thrive at 5, and found myself perfectly aligned with two visionaries who were talking about what it would take to make the big change for children, to make the big change by reaching out to them at the earliest point in life, to think about how we should work to change systems so the outcomes of babies and children are improved. So it's been the game of two halves, as I say, but it's probably more of a full circle.
Fantastic. What a journey. And thank you so much for sharing all of that. You've talked about Thrive at 5 and your work involves system change within that and place-based working. Terms we hear a lot about and social change space. What do they mean to you personally?
Systems change is a really tricky one. And I'm going to sort of take a step back and then a sort of step forward. So it's bandied around a lot now as a thing that needs to happen if we're going to have better outcomes for society. But it suggests of itself that systems have power. And what do I mean by that? Well, the system for me is all of those things that are around an individual, that surround a community. And we have constructed those. We've constructed those over centuries. It's about the public sector, it's about the structures that we have in place, it's about the laws and policies that regulate our everyday lives. And it's fair to say that we find ourselves in a strained context where those policies, those systems that are a construct around us aren't fit for purpose. And we therefore talk about the need to change those things. And I'm a believer in that. But the people that can change the system are individuals. The system doesn't tend to change itself. We need a shift in the balance of power. And we need a shift of the balance of power back into the individual, into communities. Because those are the drivers that have the greatest impact on the way that we lead our lives. And if communities operate well, then the system is forced to change around it. It is just a reflection of the way that we self-organise ourselves. So systems change. It's, if you think about I always think about Brenner's social ecological model in sort of concentric circles, which put the individual at the heart, that have the family and community organisations around that individual, and then all the other players in what's then the system. But it's that beating heart that drives the social change that causes the outer layers to move. And that's why I think it's right that if we're to make system change, we need to do the sort of work that Thrive at 5 does, which is all about making change in places, with people and with communities.
And can you expand a bit on that, what you really mean by place-based working and how that plays out in reality?
Place-based working is all about going right to the heart of, literally where people are. We are who we are because of the context in which we find ourselves. And local charities tend to get this right because they're patient, they're long-termist, because they have that humility that needs to be there to work with people on the ground. And let me just explain a little bit more about that. So making a change in a place is about understanding. It's about understanding people. It's about listening to them. It's about understanding their needs. But it's critically about not just the challenges that people speak about, but it's about the opportunities and strengths of a community. If I think about the work, if I just reflect on work we're doing in Stoke, for example, we spend months at the beginning when we set up a local team, and having local actors is really important for place-based work. It's not about parachuting in external organisations. It's about finding those drivers, local drivers of change, local people who have an interest in making things work for their own community. So it starts there. It starts with them and their understanding of what's not working, but equally their understanding of what is working. And one of the sort of great examples that I've been looking at and thinking a lot about is sort of faith groups around the country. You know, what is it there in a community when everything else has gone? And it's quite often some of these sort of local groups. It's local faith groups. It's local churches. And I don't mean by that religion, the structure of religion. I mean about people who have self-organised locally to make a difference. So good place-based work is about local people. It's about going on a journey of understanding, having the patience to listen, to learn. It's about identifying the strengths within a community. And that's both places and physical spaces, but it's about the people that make up that community, because they're there. Those strengths are there in every street, in every house. There's a strength within the individual. It requires bravery to make places work. When we're trying to overcome challenges using the strengths that we have in a community, it's about testing new things, being prepared for them to go wrong, writing the new blueprint for change. It's not always about lots of money. I always, there's an absolutely wonderful woman, Ree, who runs the community work in a church called Breathe New Life in Stoke. And I remember her being very cross when we started work, and she said, I'm just so fed up of people coming in here with their big comedy golden checks and talking about the big change, because she's somebody that lives with the challenges of her community, but the strengths of her church and her faith and the wonderful people around her, and she does good. And we've worked with her. The team there's worked with her. And the sorts of things she wanted were included a hygiene bank. What she didn't have was connection to local supermarkets, local businesses. What she needed was just a small, not even a leg up, a small foot up, to have those local connections, to build something that is making a huge difference, particularly to women in those communities who are struggling with period poverty. It's just those very small things. It's trying new things. It's trying brave things. We need people to come together, to be united in common cause, to agree on the change they want to see, pooling their assets, pooling their abilities, pooling their skills and their experience. And when that happens, and when people act with patience, are prepared for the long haul, are prepared to try new things and experiment with new things, is when you see the change.
Yeah. That's great. And what challenges have you seen in working in that way and that place-based approach?
Where to start? Where to start? The biggest challenge is rebuilding trust. Because that's the thing one sees up and down the country that has been broken. People don't believe in each other. They certainly don't believe in the system. They feel let down and sadly lost hope. And to make any sort of change requires a rebuilding of that absolutely essential ingredient, which is just a willingness for people to work together. And I mean by that individuals, I mean by that children, parents, carers, everybody who feels left on their own and alone. And they say relationship and relational working is what you need to make place-based change and to drive systems change. But relationships and the building of relationships has been said quite rightly to move at the speed of trust. and there is no substitute for taking your time in building trust. And the problem with a lot of the funding that goes into place-based change and system change, it doesn't take account of that absolutely critical stage of the journey, and one of the biggest challenge, which is to win people back around. And I would say in the projects that we have, at least the first year or so is taken in conversation. And it's not just about, and building that trust isn't just about relationships and listening. It's about then acting on what one has heard, so that people can believe that you're there to change things for the better. So trust for sure. I think the other observation I have is about defensiveness.
Mm-hmm.
There are many people, and now I'm talking about people in the system, if I can put it that way, whether they are frontline workers, whether they are people who are managing, whether they are senior leaders within the system. And here I'm talking about, if I call them civil servants, frontline workers, not the politicians. And by and large, these are compassionate. They're compassionate people. They're professionals. They've committed their lives in belief that the system can do the right thing. And it's very hard to go on a journey with people who have worked in that way, and to start having a conversation about change, because it involves an understanding that what is happening is not right and isn't working. And there's something about not just holding up the mirror in a brutal way, but that gentle hand-holding journey, which allows people to have the conversation they've had about, and recognising, and people know, people in those positions know when things aren't working, but they have to be given permission to have that conversation. And they have to be given hope that something will change.
What qualities and approaches do you believe leaders need to succeed?
The irony of your question is that leaders need to be able to fail. I mean, certainly one of the wonderful things about charities is that, or that can be true about charities, is they can be innovative, they can be creative, they can test, and they can learn, and they can change. And yet we quite often find ourselves now in a world where, and I think sometimes the nature of funding is to blame, but I think it's also the way that we think about delivering impact, that it's a sort of linear process. The truth is that things sometimes have to go wrong before they can go right, and we don't have to look any further than the world of tech and the celebration of tech bros who get it wrong. They work at pace because they want to change the world. That they get it. They're sort of spot on. They want to make the radical shift, so they'll quite happily steam through version 0.1 to before you know it, version 16.2 of your iPhone. Well, actually, that's for commercial reasons, but there's lots of failure in order to succeed. Constant pivoting and changing and making better. And as charity leaders, we need to be open to that. I'd rather like to think that tech bros have emulated charity leaders, but it's perhaps the case that charity leaders now need to take reference from the private sector and channel a bit of that spirit.
Great. Sort of different leaders of the future need different sort of characteristics, or sort of redefining that. Really interesting. Through your work at Thrive at 5, you've highlighted that around half of children eligible for free school meals aren't meeting key development goals, milestones. That's a huge challenge. How do you stay so focused and motivated on such a big and vital challenge?
The statistics sort of speak for themselves. That is my driver. And it's not just the fact of that statistic that 50% of kids at the age of 5 are not reaching their potential. it's a couple of things. It's the impact of that on the whole of their lives. There was some, which makes part of the difference, and there was a piece of research put out by the rather brilliant Professor Lee Elliott Major, a piece of work he did with UCL, which pointed out that the children who are not passing GCSEs at 16, half of those children are those children who've not reached their potential at 5. We know exactly who they are, and we fail them. And we've not just failed them, we've not failed them at 5, we've failed them for their futures. So for me, it's the awfulness of that that keeps a steely focus for me. It's unfair and it's unjust. And I think what's even more tragic about it is that this isn't a new problem. No. I had a question from a potential funder the other day who had quite rightly looked at the data around progress of children in the early years. And broadly speaking, the trajectory for all children has been getting better. I mean, it's not great. We've got a third of children, and we just look at all children, regardless of their financial status, a third of children who are not reaching good level of development, and as you said, shoots up to half of them, of those children who are living with poverty, with hardship. But for those kids who are living in hardship, it's that 50% figure that hasn't shifted for decades. Nothing has changed. For children who grow up in disadvantage in this country, outcomes have been bad, and they've continued to be bad for decades. We're just failing. We're failing to deal with one of the trickiest, wickedest problems that we have, and that doesn't sit with me. So that keeps me firmly on track until we can see that difference. We need to keep working. And I say to my teams, and probably as much saying to myself, when you wake up in the morning, have a think about the day you're about to have. And think to yourself, is anything I'm going to do today going to make a difference for those children? Because if it's not, we need to stop doing it. So I don't find it difficult to keep a focus. The challenge is more about trying to get everybody else back to the system, in the system to make this their focus. And however hard that is, I think I certainly feel that it's my responsibility to hold myself and others to account to try and make a difference.
Do you ever doubt yourself?
Every day. Aida and imposter syndrome have a great big equal sign in between them. I doubt myself in the context of the magnitude of the problem that I'd love us all to solve, and I doubt my adequacy to be part of that change. But I think it's important to doubt, because I think it encourages one to think about acting without ego, and to recognise that actually, if we're going to make a bold difference in this world, it's not about me, it's about team. Your question takes me back to a moment in those awful days as we came out of the COVID pandemic, and I went for a walk, however many metres away we had to be in those days, with my old boss. And like a lot of people, I suspect, COVID had caused me to think about what next in my professional life. And she asked me about stepping up in leadership terms, about potentially becoming a chief executive. And I remember just saying that I didn't think I had it. I didn't think I had the ability. And I think I was hoping she would say that I did. But instead she sort of ruefully laughed and put me firmly back in my box and said, "You can absolutely do it, but you're asking yourself the wrong question." And I was puzzled. And she said, "Have you thought about who you need to have around you in order to be a good leader?" And in that conversation, she reminded me that the answer to self-doubt is to surround yourself with brilliant folk. There's no one of us that has everything in our kit bag. And that message, that lesson has really stood with me. And so I think for me, trying to be a good leader and living with my self-doubt is recognising that it's not a journey that I'm travelling on my own, and that for everything that I am poor at or less able at, there is a person or people who can absolutely fill that gap. And that helps me, and I think that's absolutely critical to success and to me getting by every day.
Fantastic. You've touched on in there and earlier around collaboration and working better together. What does shared, collaborative and compassionate leadership mean to you?
Well, it's about, as I say, it's about the lack of ego, which is absolutely essential. But I think it's also about, we've been talking in my organisation quite a lot about hierarchy, and I have to admit I've sort of struggled with it, because I think I thought to myself that I have with my team been building something that's democratic, that's a level playing field, and what I've had to recognise is that collaboration and compassion is about allowing all voices to be heard in a very intentional way, encouraging everybody in an organisation in the same way that we do in a community, but in an organisation, to have a shared platform, because it's only in that way where people think that they are and are in fact bringing the whole of themselves to bear, that we can really work collaboratively. And I've discovered that actually from a leader and from me, that requires a degree of honesty on my part. So sharing of myself, sometimes things which feel very personal. Everybody has lived experience, and as a leader, if you expect others to share their lived experience in order to work together, then I believe and have had to understand that needs to come from me too. And I've had to go back to my life and draw on the truth about who I am, and to be comfortable with that, and proud of it, to recognise that I'm a mixed race woman, that I have faced prejudice in my life. I shared with the team an awful incident when, as a child, I was stoned from a footbridge by boys in my school for being, quote unquote, a Paki. Things that I haven't necessarily wanted to unearth for myself, to relive, but being honest and talking about that, and talking about who I am and how I've dealt with that, talking about being a woman in a legal profession where not many women were making it up that greasy pole, not many women were making it to partnership, where there definitely wasn't a hashtag Me Too. It was a hashtag I'm alone. But taking myself into those spaces and places mentally, which are not always comfortable, and that too with my own personal story about mental health. And I find, as difficult as it is sometimes to share with my colleagues about those things, the more I can do so, the more honest I can be, the more people feel that I am prepared to be, and I am, as indeed I am a human being, not somebody in my remote ivory tower, because that so often is people's experience of leadership, and I'd say bad leadership. that it's in that way that we get to really collaborate, because that builds trust. If you can be honest about yourself with others, so that they can trust you and trust of themselves, then we can walk together and join hands.
And how does it feel now, having shared that with the team?
I feel vulnerable. It felt uncomfortable in the moment, and I suppose I've grown up in organisations, institutions which I'm not sure if they frowned on self-disclosures, but certainly didn't create environments where that was the norm. It's felt very exposing, and I realised that I am trusting my colleagues to take what I have said and honour it and look after it and look after me. But that's an important realisation, because we so often ask others to do that. And if we can't allow ourselves to be stripped, to be naked, to be truthful, then what right do we have others to ask that of others?
Thank you for your brave and honest leadership. That's great to hear, and thank you for sharing. What do you think that means, and that type of leadership means for the future of charities in the UK and leaders within them?
I think it's time for a bit of a refresh in the charity sector. I think we play quite a lot of label bingo at the moment about how we should be in the charity world, about how we should lead the way in thinking about communities and empowerment, and how we should be thoughtful about diversity, how we should champion lived experience. But I worry slightly that these, as I say, are labels and not a reality. That it becomes formulaic and it becomes process-driven and about ticking boxes. We should look more as the sort of charity sector to some of the sort of best examples of good practice, which are quite often to be found at a very local level, because it's at that local level that you get real purpose and truth and honesty. I talked about Ree earlier. She's just one example. There are so many people who just act with kindness, and we need to rechannel ourselves into a society, and charities do, about what it is what lies at the heart of charity. And we saw it in COVID, where with the small acts of kindness, it was charities have sort of slightly lost their way in their strategies and the big talk, when in fact the things that probably make the most difference, and the things that can make a difference at scale, the social movements that we need to drive change, are driven by the individual and driven locally, and stem from basic humanity. And we didn't find that a problem when the chips were really down, when we thought, at worst the world was going to end, but that things were going to go badly wrong. Most people found within themselves charity. Charity is it's just about kindness and personal responsibility to look out for others, and personal responsibility for self, and shared responsibility for our communities. And if we could think about charities doing that very thing and working together, we'd make a lot more difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think are the biggest barriers to that change?
Well, it's back to the good old system, isn't it? we and for the right reasons, there's a tendency to try and regulate. So we have, what is it now, sort of 170,000 registered charities in this country, but something like 350,000 charities across the country. I used to think that was a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think the problem is that we get a bit you can get a bit too tied up with the reporting, with the trying to bend to fit into the models that are set by the system, by funders. I mean, something that sort of troubled me of late is this sense that charities are there to deliver services, that they're there to be commissioned by others to make the system work. It feels like a really sort of retrograde step, because it's taking charities away from the things that charities can do best, which is to be innovative, to be creative, to be driven by and for communities, to be long-termist. A charity that's delivering commissioned services has just been swept into a system that's about short-termism. And I think that some bravery is required in the charity sector to sort of cut its ties with that way of working, so that we can get back to the acts of kindness, to the community spirit, to innovation, to creativity, to being advocates for change, for creating social movements, because that's where charities have their real strength.
So if someone's listening and they're wanting to step into these big challenges, what would you say to someone who's filled with doubt?
Harness it. Just harness it. And I think I'd be more worried by anybody that said they were confident about walking in to tackle the big challenges that we face in today's world. It would suggest to me that they hadn't really understood the scale or the nature of that challenge. So I think I would say, firstly, is embrace that and be okay with it. I think I'd pass on the wise words I had from my boss, which is, you're not in this on your own, and actually your job is to find that team around you and make this a joint endeavour. And be prepared to fail, because that will happen. This is a rocky road. It's a mountainous road. There are as many downs as there are ups. If we're really going to if we're going to tackle challenge in a thoughtful way, if it was so easy, somebody would have done it a long time ago.
Definitely. What are your hopes for the future?
Oh, my hope for the future is that the work that I'm doing today will make a difference. It's a battle. It's a real battle, and I really hope that we are onto something, because I don't want to leave this world feeling that nothing is changing for children, that we are still, however many decades I have in my life, decades on, still failing the future generation and generations. And I can't kid myself that Thrive at 5, and I don't kid myself that Thrive at 5 on its own or I can make the big change. But I think we can model some of the things that can make a difference. And I hope that some of the braver politicians, and there are some out there, who are having the big conversations we need to have about poverty, about social change, about children's futures. I hope they can have the courage of their convictions and not be swayed by some of the darker voices that are always there, some of the toxicity that we have in our society. Because if they can do that, and if Thrive at 5 and the many, many good charities and good folk that are doing good work can be upheld, then there'll be some difference made in my lifetime.
Aida, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. You're inspirational, and I learn something every time we chat. And I can't go away from today without acknowledging your amazing taste in colour and clothes. And we didn't even confer on the outfit. So huge thank you for today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Jo, and thank you for channeling the Thrive at 5 brand colour.
Excellent. Brilliant.
Thanks for listening to Against the Tide, brought to you by Jo Metcalfe and Louise Kavanagh. We're grateful to the team at Sticks and Glass in Leeds and Bison Studios in London, our inspiring guests and wonderful listeners. Subscribe to Against the Tide wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode.